We're joined today by the legendary Randy Brecker, 7-time Grammy Award-winning trumpet player. He's played with everybody over the years, from Elton John to Ringo Starr to Parliament Funkadelic, and of course with his brother Michael as the Brecker Brothers. Randy, it's an honor speaking with you. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, it's okay. I happen to have some time this week before I leave. It's nice, not too stressed, so you got me at a good point.
Well, Randy, can you tell the listeners a bit about your early days, playing around Philadelphia? It seems like you and your brother both were right in the midst of when jazz was really kind of melding with R&B, had the harder edge, guys like Miles Davis. That was an exciting time, I'm sure.
Well, we both, like you mentioned, were born in Philadelphia, which had an amazing jazz scene. My father was also a semi-professional musician who played piano and wrote tunes and sang very well. He could have been a professional, but he was worried about the lifestyle and making money, so he went into business. But he loved music. That was his first love. He was a lawyer, but piano playing lawyer, he'd play whenever he could, and they had jam sessions at the house when I was a kid, so my life revolved around music. He wrote a tune for me, in fact, when I was 2 years old, called The Hottest Man in Town, and of course, to play a horn. As the lyrics went, you play a horn, maybe a hot fife, and love music even more than your wife, was part of the lyrics. So it was destiny, man. And he loved trumpet players. Clifford Brown was alive and well in Philly when I was a little kid. He died when I was about 9 or 10. So he was the talk of the town, and there was a very good trumpet player, came over, local guy, to play at the jam sessions. This guy actually moved to Detroit and had a good career as a jazz trumpet player. So I just fell in love with the instrument and started to play when I was 8 years old, took lessons from Sigmund Herring from the Philadelphia Orchestra, later with Tony Marcione, who was the top call show guy, just a virtuoso on trumpet. And he also had jazz leanings, although he didn't improvise. He was like a jazz musician inside a classical musician's body, but he loved bebop and loved Dizzy Gillespie, so he was a great way to study with and a great person to study with. He also taught Lee Morgan, the other great trumpet player from Philadelphia. And my brother continued along the same lines as me. He studied clarinet with a gentleman from the Philadelphia Orchestra, and then moved to alto for a year, and then tenor when in 10th grade. He just got more serious. He was into basketball and his chemistry set, so he got serious about it later. But when he did get serious, there was no holding him back. And we both started playing with local cats in Philly. The black community took, especially me and him. He played with Billy, what was his name? Billy Paul, who became famous with me and Mrs. Jones. Had Mike in his band, and Eric Rivat. They were about the same age. Great drummer who went on to play with Weather Report and Mark Kramer. So they had a little band in Philly. I played with Clarence C. Sharp, I should say, who was a friend of Lee's, and he let me sit in whenever I wanted. And I started doing private parties, and just gigs around as soon as I got my car. And then went to Indiana University. I'd gone there. This is a long answer to your question, I guess, but there was a lot happening. When I was 15, I went to the Stan Kenton Band Camp. That was very influential in Bloomington, Indiana. I met Dave Sanborn there, and Don Grolnick, and Lou Marini, and a bunch of great professional jazz musicians, trumpet players. Donald Byrd was there teaching. Marvin Stamm was my band director, another great player who I'm still in touch with. And that was very influential because we all stayed friends, especially me, Grolnick and Sanborn and Marini. And went home and eventually went to Indiana University. They had a great music school. And we won a contest, the Notre Dame Jazz Festival, and I won a trumpet award that Clark Terry, who was the judge, gave to me. And eventually We were sent on a State Department tour to the Middle East and Asia in February of 1966. 16 weeks, 4-month tour. Fascinating. One of the most, if not the most fascinating trips I ever had. The band led by Jerry Coker was first rate. I mean, we were pros by then. I have a great recording of the band, and then I decided to move to New York and I didn't quite finish at NYU, and I started working with Clark. He called when he found out I was in town. And another thing that was influential, at the end of the tour, there was a international competition in Vienna, and we ended the tour in Greece, and some of us made our way to this international competition where the judges were Mel Lewis, Ron Carter, Joe Zawinul, Art Farmer, Cannonball Adderley, and J.J. Johnson. And I got a prize at that. I came in second on trumpet. My friend Frank Ambrosetti beat me by 1/10 of a point. But I met so many young musicians there that really helped my career, like Miroslav Vitus, George Mraz, Claudio Roditi, Joachim Kuhn, Eddie Daniels, Franco Ambrosetti, I might have mentioned, and all the judges. So when I moved to New York, Ron Carter called me for gigs, and I joined the Thad Jones Mel Lewis Orchestra. And it's all, in a way, happenstance. I was in the right place at the right time. And it's a long answer, but that's how it all kind of developed.
It is incredible the way that you went up, and I know you could have probably gone more of a traditional route with orchestra music, or maybe stuck to the jazz side of things. But I know you.
Yeah, I mean, I was a decent classical player, nothing like Wynton. I played in the opera orchestra at Indiana University and sat in the pit for a couple operas. And the classical studies, you can tell that I had training, but I as did Wynton. I got away from the classical side. It was hard to keep both going. And what I really wanted to do was to play jazz and improvise. And that all came from, the stuff at home. My father wasn't a big fan of classical music, although I love it. He said it all sounded the same to him. So that was kind of not that, for lack of a better word, intelligent remark, because there's so much varied music. But I love listening to classical music and world music. And really any music. I like to bring other concepts into my brain when I improvise. So it's been a fun life doing this all these years.
And I know you eventually joined up with Blood, Sweat, and Tears. And was that kind of the, I guess that first album, was that kind of what led you into more of maybe the harder jazz rock kind of realm?
Yeah, well, I always, Philly was an R&B town, and I did a lot of, besides playing jazz, I played in a really nice organ trio. There was a million of them in Philly, and a blues band where you kind of made up your parts, led by a cop whose nickname was Mr. Blues. And I always loved R&B and some pop music when the Beatles and Rolling Stones came along. So when I was asked to join Blood, Sweat, and Tears, I didn't have a regular gig, and that was a salaried position. I didn't have a ownership in the band. I was a sideman, but they paid us whether we worked or not. And that first record really became kind of a classic. I still enjoy it, and it's really up there in some of the best jazz rock records, if you want to call it that. I don't know if it really fits under the category, but records whenever we made it, 1960, I think it was 67, 66, with Al Cooper kind of in that lead role, really has a place in rock and roll history, I think. Personally, I like him better than that one, way better than a lot of the later records. And that had a big influence on me, just seeing how many people love rock music and how many people came out to these gigs. So it was a whole different story than the jazz world would play. I mean, I had at the time of my life playing with Clark Terry's band, Duke Pearson's big band, Thad and Mel big band. There was a lot, I played at the half note ends, but, we got paid like $10 or $20. and those clubs only held 50 or 60 people. Next thing I know, I'm doing big concerts, with blood, sweat, and tears, not arenas, but big concerts, hall. One, I remember I was just thinking about this the other night. We actually played, he opened for us, Elton John's first gig in America.
Wow.
So I learned so much about the business, and the music had a big effect. We went out to California and played Winterland and all the famous, clubs that you hear about. And I heard Stevie Winwood live and Cream and the Stones, and it just had a big influence on me as a young person.
Well, you've released so many albums of your own and with your brother, in addition to all the other stuff that you've played on. If you're playing with, like an Elton John or Paul Simon, Ringo Starr, whomever, how do you keep everything straight as far as like consciously not, playing something that maybe sounds too similar to something else you've already done?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. And sometimes you can't, especially, so I'll digress. These days I get called for to do file sharing. And I started keeping track. We do them in our basement. We have a little studio down there, and I've probably played. I started keeping track during COVID, where we were getting a lot of calls, and we've done close to 500 sessions since COVID on people's records from all over the world. I've hardly met in person any of them, but each of those have a trumpet or flugelhorn solo on it, and that's when you really get caught up because you don't even know the people, and a lot of the solos have a few of the same licks in them. You can't avoid that. But I was pretty good when you're in the studios with the artists, and there were everybody, and the band was in the studio back in the day. You just familiarize yourself with the artist's output, and that might have a slight effect on the way you phrase something, or even your sound as far as playing soft or loud. You try to get to know the artist and tailor what you do, and that's what most so-called sessions musicians were good at.
Sure.
And not that sometimes we chose the wrong thing. We're good at taking guidance. That's also being a session musician. You take guidance or criticism. You're working for somebody. But that was also taught me a lot about human nature and just how to survive in the music business. And I had fun during my session musician period, maybe because I am a trumpet player and I was always playing in a section with good other players. So it's probably more interesting for me than my brother, who he was a great doubler, but he didn't like playing flute. He didn't like playing any other instruments except tenor and iwi. As Sanborn was the same way. He just didn't enjoy it. They wanted to be solo artists.
Well, when you're playing with bands, like maybe Aerosmith or Dire Straits, Springsteen, some of these bands that maybe don't incorporate a lot of horns usually, do they have like sheet music or parts in mind for you, or do you kind of have to write all that stuff on the spot? Well,
each session was different, and I don't have much memory of how they. The one I remember is Bruce, who I knew a little before I got there. Somehow I had been hanging with him a little. This before he reached the top. He was on his way up, and we showed up, me, Mike, and Sanborn, and a trombone player named Wayne Andre, and they had music paper on the music stands, but nothing written. And we weren't paid or expecting to have to, which we were good at, about jamming up horn parts. But that one session was a little more rock and roll rather than funk than we were used to. And we struggled a bit, we had it about halfway done. I've told this story many times, and he's told the story. There was a big hubbub in the booth, and a guy came in, Miami Steve Van Zandt, and he got on the talkback and said, "No, that's not right. That sounds terrible. That's not right for the tune." So he really helped us. He had some lines, and we got it together. And we came up with something pretty good for 10th Avenue Freeze Out and a couple other tunes. But that was the main one. And then I played overdubbed on Meeting Across the River, which was already done. I just played over the whole thing and played a little solo. But usually it was really professionally done. Somebody had charts, like for the other bands that you mentioned, and we just read the music. And they were usually professionally done, and we might make changes or suggestions, work with the artist, but that was the norm. We'd get a call from a thing called Radio Registry, a musician's answering service, and they would call in the date. They'd say, "Randy, it's Registry. If you can do it, it's tomorrow, 10 to 1, 2 to 5 for whoever, Blue Oyster Cult or Steven Tyler's band that you mentioned," and you'd either accept it or say NG, and then move on to the next person. And quite often the artists weren't even there. It was just the arranger and the producer.
Sure.
Well, Steven Tyler at those dates, he usually was there, and the band was there. But more often than not, it was just you and the arranger and producer.
Right.
And you play with 5 or 6 horns and move on to the next one. Sometime run to the next one.
I got to ask you, you've played on what I think could maybe be the best album ever recorded, Parliament's Mothership Connection. Do you have any favorite stories or memories from that time?
Well, that was unforgettable because, and I just, who was I talking to? I forget, but I just remembered this whole story talking to a friend. Somebody was interviewing me about Dennis Chambers, who was part of this. So, I got called to do, by Registry, I think, to play on the Clinton record and Mothership Connection. And first of all, they were late. We got there. There's another trumpet player named Joe Shepley. Sadly, he's passed away. I don't think my brother was on this, but Maceo Parker and Fred Wesley, I think. I might be wrong, but I think that was the horn section. And Bernie Worrell was there. We did some of his charts. One of my favorites was Handcuffs. I always mention that one. I think that's some genius horn writing. But they were late getting there, and I went down to, I was still smoking a little cigarettes, and I went down to the street level and just smoked a cigarette and whiled away the time. And all of a sudden, a beat-up old brown station wagon pulled up, and out came in full regalia Bootsy and Clinton, dressed up with all their clothes on, and they had the tapes not in boxes under their arms, with the leader dragging on the ground. And apparently Dennis was in the car, but he didn't introduce himself. And about 30 years later, he said, "Man, remember when I saw you smoking a cigarette?" He decided then to tell me he was in the car. By then we had played together a million times with Mike Stern. And the session was just really a lot of fun to do, and that's just a classic record. George paid us by check. That was his company was Thang Inc., Thang.
Awesome. Yeah, I know you played on the clones of Dr. Funkenstein as well, and I'm sure you were a fan of James Brown coming up. So how was that for you playing, with guys like Maceo and Fred Wesley and getting everybody in the studio?
It was great. They were a big influence on me, just their concept, their sound concept, especially Fred's writing. I did a session before, a jazz session that was written by Fred Wesley before I knew he was the funk guy. And he was a great all-around musician. He could really write outside of R&B, but his R&B stuff had a big influence on me when I started to write. And we became friendly, and we just did a gig opposite him 3 or 4 months ago at Sony Hall. Brecker Brothers band reunion. We went on first, and then we stuck around to hear Fred with his soul band. It was just great.
It is incredible the amount of music that you've made and the albums. And, if you look online, maybe like on a Wikipedia or something, I imagine that's probably not even a tenth of everything that you've done over your career.
Yeah, we were quite busy, and there was a lot of work for like 20 years from the late 60s. It started to slow down with technology kind of towards the 90s, with MIDI and just drum machines and mechanical stuff. But we had a good run there, probably 3,000 records, something like that. I've seen discographies that go up to like close to 2,000, but there's a lot of stuff missing. And then all these later years where we didn't keep track at first, but probably 600, 700, or 800 just home recordings and videos for people all over the world, most of which I never hear a thing about. I don't know what they do with them, but that's the way the business is now.
Sure. Well, what do you think it is like for musicians now? I mean, horn players. Do you see a lot of real horns being used still, or are they kind of being replaced by electronics now?
Well, sadly, they're being replaced, but they're for the most part, especially in the real pop world, and the hip hop world, you rarely find a real horn section or a real anything. It's all machines, and it's all usually done by a programmer or two, and a lot of people contribute. You might notice on the Grammys, a lot of the writers of some of the songs have 8 people, because inputting on the tunes. But on our level, Broadway is still happening with, there's the union gets in and makes sure there's certain live musicians there, but it's slowly but surely that's going away. There's less live musicians, and they have a way to have a robotic conductor on some of the shows. But there is, I think, a need and a thirst for hearing live musicians on records. It's become kind of a trend with the sale of vinyl now, and people in the know really love music. I think it's trending back towards having better songs and live musicians and more diverse choices so that everything doesn't sound the same. I think that's kind of a slowly moving trend that I feel, and I'm welcoming it.
Excellent. Well, Randy, I know you're still keeping real busy. You've got a lot of the clinics and shows and the things that you're doing now. What are you working on now as far as new music or anything we should be looking out for?
Well, I haven't been so much. I'm taking a break from doing projects because I've been so busy. But the last thing which I worked on was actually not my record, but I co-produced it with my wife, whose name is Ada Rovati. She's a wonderful saxophonist and composer, arranger. She wrote all the music, the lyrics, got together bands. Well, I helped her with that, and got some really good singers to sing her lyrics, like Kurt Elling and Nikki Harris, who's Gene Harris's daughter. We're on the cruise with her, a great soul singer, every year, and a couple other singers, and that took a lot of work, but it did pretty well, and it got in the top 10 on the radio charts. And she's just getting better and better. So that was really the last hands-on thing we did. It came out close to 9 or 10 months ago. And she designed all the artwork and sewed her personal tuxedo that she put together. So she was great. And I have certain ideas in mind for maybe next year. I'll do maybe a kind of Brazilian record. I haven't done one in a while. Those seem to do well. But I haven't really figured it out yet, to tell you the truth. I'm so busy running around and doing other people's stuff, which suits me fine.
Well, I do appreciate you taking some time out with me. And again, it's been an honor speaking with you. I'm a huge fan of a lot of the things, and a lot of them I didn't even realize was you until I started digging into things. Again, it's incredible, the body of work that you've had. Well,
thank you so much, and thanks for the call. And I'd love to meet you in person sometime if I'm out where you are. I hope our paths cross. Appreciate it, Dustin. Thanks for thinking of me.
And again, that was the one and only Randy Brecker. You can find out about everything he has on the way at randybrecker.com.